Well, happy Monday, everybody. Hope you had a great weekend. So glad you've joined me today for this devotion. We're in the book of 2 Kings 25, continuing the story from Friday, which we looked at in chapter 24. And you'll remember that in 598, 597 BC, Babylon had put down a rebellion by Judah and installed a new king named Zedekiah. And for several years, Zedekiah paid the taxes or tribute to Babylon because they were a conquered nation. And Jeremiah was the prophet, and we read about that in his book, in Jerusalem during all of this. And he was telling Zedekiah, pay the taxes. That's God's plan. If you rebel, it's going to be bad. But there are all these false prophets in Jerusalem, just like there were false prophets over in Babylon preaching against what Ezekiel was preaching. Ezekiel and Jeremiah were saying the same thing. But these false prophets were opposing them, and these false prophets got in the ear of King Zedekiah and eventually convinced him to withhold the tribute, the taxes. And the results were tragic. By this time, Nebuchadnezzar had had enough of this rebellious Jewish nation. And so in chapter 25 of 2 Kings, this will be in 587 it starts, and it finishes in 586 BC. Now, in verse 1 of chapter 25 of 2 Kings. Now, in the 5th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, encamped against it, and built a siege wall around it. So Jerusalem is totally surrounded by this massive army, cut off. Nobody can get in, nobody can get out. And they mention here that that lasted 2 years, and in time famine became severe. And Ezekiel, we saw some of those verses in recent days where he talked about how a lot of people would die from famine and pestilence, or the disease that comes from all of that death. And in chapter 1, verse 3, on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. And then the city was broken into. Eventually, near the end of 2 years, they after all the devastation of famine and so on, and disease, the Babylonians finally knocked down the walls of Jerusalem and breached the walls, if you will. And so verse 4, the city was broken into, and all the men of war fled by night by way of the gate between the two walls beside the king's garden, though the Chaldeans were all around the city, and they went by the way of Arabah. So the king and some of his soldiers tried to escape, and they got away for a while. But in verse 5, the army of the Chaldeans, that's the Babylonians, another name for Babylonians, pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. So they went north, but the Babylonians caught up with them, and all his army was scattered from him. And in verse 6, they captured the king. So this is Zedekiah. Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army captures King Zedekiah. And they brought him to the king. They brought him to the king of Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar. And he passed sentence on him. And in verse 7, whoa. Notice what Nebuchadnezzar did to Zedekiah. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. So Zedekiah has to stand there as an imprisoned king and watch his children executed in front of him. And then they put out the eyes of Zedekiah. Now listen to that. The last thing Zedekiah saw before they blinded him was his children being executed. And they bound him with bronze fetters. They put him in chains, and they brought him to Babylon, taken away as a slave. And drop down to verse 9, he burned, Nebuchadnezzar and his general, his soldiers, his army, burned the house of the Lord. That's the temple. I mean, they'd already taken all the gold and everything out of it 10 years earlier. And now they burn it to the ground. They burn the king's house, the palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house he burned with fire. In verse 10, so all the army of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who were with the captain of the guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. They knocked down, they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. And the rest of the people in verse 11 who were left, remember, they had taken away all the leaders, if you will, skilled people in 598, 97. That's when Ezekiel was taken to Babylon. And now they take another large mass of people. And they carry, at the end of verse 11, they carried them away into exile. The end of verse 21, so Judah was led away into exile, and only a handful of people remained, the poorest of the poor. It's just tragic. And then Nebuchadnezzar makes a man named Gedaliah the governor of Judah. There's not enough people to have a king, so Gedaliah is made governor of the few poor people that remain there, and they're left there mainly to, care for the vineyards and crops and so on. But the story's not over. Look at verses 25 and 26. And it came about in the 7th month, so 7 months after Gedaliah is made king, these men, they come down to Gedaliah in the middle of verse 25. These are some of the Jewish soldiers who had escaped death and imprisonment and deportation during the Babylonian invasion. I don't know if they've been somewhere else, if they hid out, but a handful of captains of soldiers, if you will. And they came and they struck Gedaliah down so that he died. They executed, they assassinated Gedaliah along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were there with him at Mizpah. So in other words, Gedaliah and the handful of Jews who were there helping him be governor, and the Babylonians that Nebuchadnezzar had left behind to oversee things, these soldiers, they come in and they kill them all. And then in verse 26, all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. I mean, people are stupid sometimes. They really are. So they killed Gedaliah and these Jewish officials who were trying to help, and they killed the Babylonians that the king of Babylon left behind. And, that might not have been such a smart thing. He may come back here and kill us. And so they all fled to Egypt. We're not told about it here, but we are in the book of Jeremiah. They, by force, against his will, took Jeremiah with them to Egypt, where Jeremiah probably lived out the rest of his days and died. Now, what do you and I learn from all this? Well, there's a lot. But one thing is, bad rulers and ungodly rulers always eventually bring about ruin and destruction. Nebuchadnezzar was an evil king. I mean, he killed thousands of people. He enslaved thousands of people. Yes, he was a great military leader. He rebuilt Babylon, including one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But he was evil. He was pagan. But God used him. He was God's instrument, not to bless God's people, but to judge God's people, to punish God's people for their sin. I sometimes wonder, I sometimes think, I can't say this definitively, so I won't, but I sometimes wonder if God is not already judging America. And if perhaps God is not giving us the kind of leaders we deserve. The presidents we deserve. Our next presidential election, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether it's Biden or Trump, maybe, just maybe, God's giving us what we deserve. And he's using them to judge us because we don't deserve better. Maybe. Just maybe. The most important thing for us would not be who wins any election. Maybe, just maybe. The really important thing would be for us to fall on our face before God and repent of our sin, of our arrogance, of our pride, of our indifference, of our ungodliness, of our compromise, of our lack of evangelism, of our lack of holiness and purity, of our lack of love and justice for the underprivileged, maybe, just maybe, we need to repent of our materialism. And then, maybe, just maybe, God might raise up for us the kind of leader that would be a blessing and not an instrument of judgment. Just something to chew on. I'll see you tomorrow.